Welcome back to The Curious Case. I'm Davis. Tell me, where are you listening from tonight? And how was your day? I always love hearing from you. Drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe for more cozy mysteries. Tonight, Miss Marple visits the quiet village of Willowmere, a place that should feel peaceful. But something is off. A whisper moves through the lanes, and a truth someone hid for years is finally stirring. Willowmere sat in late autumn stillness. Cold air, soft light, shops winding down for the afternoon. Miss Marple walked slowly along the lane, taking in the small details most people overlooked. She always noticed what others missed. Today was no different. She paused outside the bakery. A man stood near the door. His hand trembled as he held a paper bag. Not from cold, from worry. Miss Marple watched him for a moment. He noticed her. He looked away. He stepped inside without a word. Odd behavior, but Willowmere was full of quiet corners and quiet secrets. At the market square, the stalls were unusually silent. No chatter, no laughter, only the shuffle of feet on stone. Miss Marple felt it, a hush that did not belong to the season. It belonged to something else. She had felt such silences before. Villages often sensed trouble long before anyone named it. Mrs. Helga Rowe stood behind the post office counter. She adjusted her spectacles. She nodded politely when Miss Marple passed, but her eyes drifted toward the high street with a worried look, as if expecting someone or avoiding someone. Mr. Colin Priest, the butcher, swept leaves from his doorstep. A simple task. Yet his movements were tense, quick. He paused when Miss Marple greeted him. He forced a smile, too quick, too stiff. Something weighed on his mind. Lydia Fernwell, the village painter, stood near the fountain with a satchel of brushes. She watched the clouds, but she was not really watching clouds. She kept glancing toward the churchyard path. Her fingers tapped the side of her satchel. A nervous rhythm. Miss Marple noticed. Artists often hid worry poorly. Their hands revealed more truth than their words. Vicar Robert Ashcroft crossed the square with his coat folded over his arm. He nodded to Miss Marple, but he seemed distracted. He looked toward the bakery, then toward the post office, then toward the church, as if counting the faces he expected to see, or the faces he feared seeing. Miss Marple continued down the lane. She stopped when something brushed against her shoe. A small notebook, plain cover, worn corners. She bent slowly, picked it up, and looked around. No one stepped forward to claim it. She opened it. A page was missing, not torn by accident, torn with intent. The edges were uneven, fresh. The missing page had been removed recently. Miss Marple closed the notebook and slipped it into her bag. Willowmere was full of simple people, but not simple minds. Someone needed this notebook. Someone did not want that missing page found. She walked on. Small details built patterns. Patterns built truth. Truth rarely hid well. The wind shifted. Cold brushed her cheek. She turned her head slightly, sensing something. Footsteps, movement. No, just stillness, but stillness with purpose. She approached the church gate. The iron was cool to the touch. The path was empty. Yet something made her pause. A weight in the air. A feeling she had learned never to ignore. She lifted her gaze. Slowly. Carefully. A figure stood behind the gate. Motionless. Watching her. And then, the figure stepped back into the shadows. Miss Marple reached Willowmere's west lane. A small cottage stood at the end. Quiet. Curtains half drawn, chimney cold. Mr. Harold Blythe lived there, a retired station clerk, a man known for punctual habits and polite manners. Today his door was open a slit, very unlike him. Miss Marple tapped gently. No answer. She tapped again. Still nothing. She pushed the door a little more. It moved without resistance. She stepped inside. Mr. Harold Blythe sat at his table, hands clasped, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on the floor. He looked older than she remembered, tired, frightened. "Mr. Blythe," Miss Marple said softly. He lifted his head slowly. His face was pale, his lips trembled. He tried to speak, but no words came, only a faint breath. Miss Marple walked closer. She sat across from him, her voice gentle. "What troubles you, Mr. Blythe?" His hands shook. He reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a sealed envelope, brown paper, edges slightly bent. His fingers clutched it with desperate care. He pushed it toward her. "For you," he whispered. "Before nightfall. Please. Before nightfall." Miss Marple did not touch it at once. She watched his expression. The fear was real, not imagined, not exaggerated. Real fear never needs decoration. It tells its own truth. "What is inside it?" she asked. He swallowed hard. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then forced the words out with effort. "A name," he said, "and something I should have given up long ago." Miss Marple studied the envelope. No markings, no stamp, no address, just a faint crease across the center. "Why give it to me?" she asked quietly. Mr. Blythe looked toward the window. The curtain fluttered slightly. He flinched at the sound. "They watch," he whispered. "They listen. I cannot trust anyone else. You must take it. You must keep it safe." Miss Marple leaned back. She had seen fear like this before. Men burdened with old secrets. Secrets that weighed more heavily with age. Secrets that refused to rest. "What happened, Mr. Blythe?" she asked. He shook his head. "I waited too long. And now I hear things. Footsteps. Voices. Someone was outside last night. Someone knows I kept it." His breath grew uneven. He pressed a hand to his chest. Not in pain, in panic. "Please," he said. "Take it. Do not let them find it." Miss Marple reached out. She placed her hand gently on the envelope. She did not lift it yet. She waited. Sometimes the act of waiting revealed more truth than questions. Mr. Blythe looked toward the door. His eyes widened suddenly. Fear sharpened. "They followed me," he whispered. "I think they followed me here." Miss Marple turned slightly. She listened. Silence. Deep. Heavy. Then, a loud, sharp knock exploded against the door. Miss Marple returned to Willowmere later that afternoon. The sky had dimmed. Shops were closing. A stillness hung over the village. Not peaceful, just heavy. She walked toward Harold Blythe's cottage with a quiet sense of concern. The door, once ajar, now stood wide open. She paused. She called his name. No answer. Only the faint echo of her own voice. She stepped inside. Dr. Philip Warren stood near the table. Constable James Brooker moved about the small room, taking notes. Both men looked serious, too serious for an ordinary afternoon. Miss Marple spoke softly. "What has happened?" Constable Brooker turned. His face told the story before his words did. "Mrs. Marple, I'm afraid Mr. Blythe has passed." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her eyes sharpened. "How long ago?" "Not long," Dr. Warren replied. 15 minutes at most. A neighbor called us after seeing the door open. We arrived just in time to determine he was gone." Miss Marple scanned the room quietly. She did not rush. She absorbed small details, the ones others overlooked. Harold Blythe lay slumped near the table, not on the floor, not in a chair, somewhere between. A final movement interrupted. Miss Marple lowered her gaze. No signs of long illness, no sign of natural rest. His hand still clutched the edge of the chair, as if reaching, as if resisting something. Her attention moved to the window. It was raised, not fully, just a few inches, enough for a hand, enough for a plan. She noted the catch, forced slightly, not broken, but tampered with. On the desk, ink had spilled. Black, fresh. A trail ran down one corner. Someone had knocked it over in haste, or in struggle. Papers were missing. The stack Harold kept so neatly had vanished. Only a few stray corners remained. Torn, pulled, taken. The small drawer beside the table was empty. Yes, completely empty. Miss Marple knew Harold stored bills there, receipts, scraps of notes, all gone now. She shifted her view to the floor. The rug was out of place by a full foot. Not kicked by accident, moved by force, moved by someone in a hurry. Dr. Warren cleared his throat. "We believe it may have been the stress," he said gently. "He was fragile." Miss Marple said nothing. Her silence answered him. She knelt slowly. She saw a footprint, near the rug's edge, clear enough to read shape. Heavy heel, deep tread. Beside it she found a smear of soot, not from the hearth. Harold's fireplace had not been used in days. This soot came from outside, or from someone who had been near smoke, or fire, or something hidden. Miss Marple stood. Her eyes moved carefully from object to object, pattern to pattern, cause to cause. She stepped closer to Harold's still figure. She looked down, quietly, respectfully, and with absolute certainty. This was no peaceful passing. Miss Marple stepped away from Harold Blythe's cottage with quiet purpose. She carried her basket close to her side. Not out of fear, out of habit. A habit formed over years of careful observation and quiet caution. She walked a few steps, then stopped. Something nudged at her thoughts. A detail, a question, a tiny concern. She opened her basket calmly. She checked the top layer, her gloves, her handkerchief, her small notebook, but not the envelope. She moved the items gently. Still nothing. The envelope Harold Blythe had trusted to her was gone. Miss Marple closed the basket slowly. No panic, only calculation. She retraced her steps in her mind. She had not opened the basket since leaving Harold's home. She had not set it down. Not once. Which meant the envelope had been taken before she even knew it was missing. But where? She reviewed her path. Quietly. Precisely. She had visited 3 places before reaching Blythe's home. 3 chances for a careful hand to slip something away. The post office. She had greeted Mrs. Helga Rowe. They had spoken briefly. Her basket had hung at her elbow while she reached for a small parcel. A moment of distraction. The chapel yard. She had stopped to look at the notice board. She had lifted her basket to read a corner posting. She remembered hearing footsteps behind her, soft, then fading. The market bench. She had sat for hardly a minute. 2 children had passed. A man walking his dog. Normal moments. Simple moments. Yet simple moments often hid simple crimes. Miss Marple stood still. She looked down the lane. Her mind moved piece by piece. Someone wanted the envelope. Someone knew Harold Blythe still held on to something from the past. Someone followed him. And now, someone followed her. She walked toward the square. Not quickly. Not slowly. At her usual calm pace. Mrs. Rowe closed the post office shutter. She waved. Miss Marple waved back. Mr. Colin Preece stacked crates outside his shop. He nodded. So did she. Everything looked ordinary. Precisely the kind of moment when danger preferred to hide. Miss Marple stepped near the fountain. She adjusted her basket again. She lifted her eyes carefully. Across the square, near the old stone wall, a figure stood. Still. Quiet. Watching her. A charcoal coat, high collar, gloves. No movement except the steady gaze fixed in her direction. Too still for casual curiosity. Too focused for chance. Miss Marple turned her head slightly. She pretended to study the fountain's edge. She gave the figure time to shift, to reveal intention. People often betrayed themselves with movement, but the figure did not move, not even a fraction. She lowered her gaze. She let her breath settle. She allowed the weight of truth to form. Someone had taken the envelope. Someone had been close enough to touch her basket. Someone bold. Someone desperate. She whispered to herself. Soft. calm. Someone wanted that envelope. Desperately. Constable James Brooker met Miss Marple near the garden gate of Harold Blythe's cottage. He carried a small notebook. His coat was dusted with mud from the path. His expression was serious. "Mrs. Marple," he said, "I found something you should see." Miss Marple gave a small nod. She followed him across the narrow patch of grass. The soil was soft. Rain from the night before had loosened the earth. That made impressions clearer, sometimes helpful, sometimes troubling. Constable Brooker pointed to the ground. "Footprints," he said. "Fresh. Made not long before we arrived." Miss Marple bent slightly. She examined the marks. Heavy tread, deep heel, a firm stride. Not Harold Blythe. Harold had a soft step and wore thinner shoes. "These are from a larger shoe," Miss Marple said. "Likely a man, someone taller, someone heavier." Constable Brooker nodded. "That's my thinking too, and look here." He pointed toward the cottage wall, mud smudges, soot mixed into the streaks. Miss Marple leaned closer. She touched the soot with her gloved fingers. It marked easily. Fresh soot, not old. "From the railway yard?" Constable Brooker asked. "Possibly," Miss Marple said. "But soot is a wandering thing. It clings to coats, hands, tools, old chimneys. It tells a story, but never the full story." She stood and looked toward the window. It sat slightly raised. The latch was pushed upward. The wood marked with a faint scrape. "Forced from outside," Miss Marple said. "Not skillfully, but deliberately." Constable Brooker folded his arms. The intruder knew where to reach. Most strangers wouldn't know this window stuck halfway. You need to lift it at an angle. Miss Marple nodded again. So the intruder had been here before, or had watched Harold Blythe enough to learn. She walked toward the back lane. The footprints continued in that direction. Not all clear, some broken by fallen leaves. But the pattern remained steady. One stride after another, leading away from the cottage, leading toward the road. Miss Marple paused at the edge of the lane. Her eyes moved slowly along the ground. The shape of the shoe became clearer here. A wide sole, thick heel. Not common in Willowmere, not worn by Mr. Preece, not worn by the vicar, not worn by the postmaster. Someone from outside, someone whose presence did not belong. Constable Brooker knelt by a small patch of disturbed soil. "Something was dropped here," he said, "or picked up. Hard to tell." Miss Marple crouched beside him. She brushed the dirt aside gently. Her gloved fingertips caught on a small edge. Paper. She lifted it slowly. A torn scrap. Thin, crisp, freshly ripped. Words written in hurried ink. Uneven, but still readable. "Proof enclosed. H." Miss Marple held the scrap between two fingers. She studied it with calm certainty. Patterns were forming. Footprints, soot, a forced window, a missing envelope, a desperate man. She looked toward the lane again. Someone had fled. Someone had carried something important. And someone had left this one piece behind. She lowered her voice. Quiet. Measured. "Harold tried to warn someone," she said, "and the one he feared was already near." Miss Marple returned to Harold Blythe's cottage early the next morning. Constable Brooker had allowed her a short, supervised look through Harold's belongings, not formally, just politely. He trusted her judgment more than he admitted. The cottage felt different now. Still. Heavy. The air carried the weight of unfinished business. Miss Marple moved through the small kitchen, then into Harold's sitting room. Her eyes scanned shelves, drawers, corners. She searched not for objects, but for intention. Harold Blythe was a man of habit. He kept things neat. He kept things ordered. He kept things where logic said they belonged, so anything hidden would be somewhere logical to him, but overlooked by others. She noticed a stack of railway timetables on the desk. Old ones, very old, yellowed, edges curled. She moved them carefully. Below them lay a thin wooden board. One corner lifted slightly. She pressed it. It shifted. A small compartment revealed itself. Simple, homemade, barely noticeable unless one was looking for it. Inside it lay Harold's ledger. Worn cover, tied with a simple string. Miss Marple untied it gently. She opened the first pages. Neat handwriting filled every line. Dates, times, weather notes, train schedules, all ordinary, until page 12. The tone changed. The entries shifted. Not routine, not simple. Fire at East Bridge siding, one line read. Miss Marple paused. She remembered hearing of it. A railway fire years ago, barely spoken of, dismissed as an accident. Harold's next notes were sharper, more urgent. Station master missing, no explanation given. Report destroyed before filing. Inspector Grant Holliver arrived, stayed 1 hour only, left quickly. Miss Marple read the lines twice. Harold had written them quietly, carefully, as if afraid even of his own pen. Page after page documented inconsistencies. Train logs altered, statements changed, witnesses not interviewed, a full report prepared, then burned. Harold wrote that part with a shaking line. Someone ordered silence, one entry said. No one dared question Holliver. Miss Marple turned to the back of the ledger. More entries, shorter, heavier. 20 years later, the truth still waits. The missing station master's family deserves answers. I kept the evidence Holliver tried to remove. It was wrong. But I could not burn it. I could not forget. Miss Marple closed the ledger softly. Her features did not change, but her eyes sharpened with quiet clarity. Harold Blythe had lived with this secret for decades. He had stored facts in his careful way. He had kept track of wrongs no one else dared mention, and he had feared someone would return for them. She lifted the ledger again. She turned to the final page. A short line waited at the bottom, written only yesterday. They know I kept it. They are coming. Miss Marple exhaled softly, nearly a whisper, barely a breath. Someone feared this would surface, after 20 long years. Miss Marple walked to Rosebank Cottage, the home of Mrs. Eleanor Blythe, Harold's widowed sister. The path was lined with fallen leaves, quiet, still. Eleanor opened the door before Miss Marple could knock. Her eyes were red, her voice soft. "Come in, Miss Marple," she murmured. Miss Marple stepped inside. The cottage smelled of tea left too long on the stove. Eleanor guided her to a chair but did not sit immediately. Her hands trembled as she wiped them on her apron. Ink stained her sleeve. Dark. Fresh. Miss Marple noticed it at once. A small detail, but important. "Have you been writing?" Miss Marple asked gently. Eleanor hesitated. She pulled her arm slightly behind her. "A little," she whispered. Her eyes avoided Miss Marple's. She looked toward the mantel, then toward the floor, anywhere but at the truth. Miss Marple spoke softly. "You were close to your brother." Eleanor nodded. A quiet tear slipped down her cheek. "He carried burdens, Miss Marple. Heavy ones. But he never deserved this." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Harold trusted you. I believe he told you something. Not everything, but enough to worry you." Eleanor's breath caught. She sank into the chair opposite Miss Marple. Her fingers twisted the edge of her apron. She did not look up. "I told him not to keep it," she said. "I begged him, for years." "What did he keep, Mrs. Blythe?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not mine to tell, not fully, but I knew he had a ledger, and I knew he wrote down things from the old days, things that made him uneasy." Miss Marple waited. Patience often opened doors faster than force. Eleanor looked at the ink on her sleeve. She wiped it again, though it changed nothing. "I wrote him a note this morning," she said. "I told him to burn anything that frightened him, told him to let old sorrows rest. I slipped the note under his door. He never replied." Another tear formed. She brushed it away. "I thought the past had no strength left," she whispered. but something stirred it again. I felt it. You feel things like that in a village. Something shifts. Something wakes. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. Someone came to see him, or someone frightened him. Did he mention a visitor? Eleanor shook her head quickly. No name, no face, only fear. He told me last week that shadows had grown longer around him, that someone wanted what he kept. I did not understand. I did not ask. Miss Marple's voice remained calm. You knew part of the truth, but not the danger behind it. Eleanor nodded slowly. Her hands clutched each other. Harold carried guilt, Miss Marple, not for wrongdoing, but for silence, and silence becomes a heavy thing. Miss Marple stood. She touched Eleanor's arm gently. The ink again smeared faintly. You are not to blame, Miss Marple said, but someone else is. Eleanor lifted her head. Fear flickered in her eyes. Miss Marple lowered her voice, measured, quiet. But someone else had everything to lose. Miss Marple sat in the small reading room of the Willowmere Library. Old newspapers lay stacked on a side table. Railway records sat neatly in boxes along the back wall. The librarian, Mrs. Clara Fenton, had agreed to let her look through them quietly. Miss Marple began with the older papers. She skimmed headlines, small notices, accidents, the usual pieces villages forget. Then a name appeared. Silas Crane, a brief mention, a railway clerk, transferred, moved frequently, never stayed long, an unusual pattern. She folded the clipping. She placed it aside. Patterns mattered. Names appeared for reasons. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. Mrs. Fenton stepped forward. Looking for something particular, Miss Marple? Miss Marple smiled gently. Just revisiting old events. Mrs. Fenton nodded, then whispered, A stranger asked about the same papers yesterday. Tall man, charcoal coat, sharp face. Didn't give a name. Miss Marple's eyes lowered. Did he look uneasy? Mrs. Fenton thought for a moment. Not uneasy, just fixed, as if he already knew the answers he wanted. Miss Marple thanked her. She returned to the table. She opened a railway ledger from the year of the East Bridge fire. Pages marked with soot. Not Harold's ledger. An older one. Entries in multiple hands. There it was. A signature. Silas Crane. Written beside an inspection date. 2 days before the fire. And a second entry. Same name. 1 week after the fire. Short note. Report incomplete. Miss Marple traced the signature lightly. So he had been there, at the time, during the confusion, during the cover-up. She closed the ledger. Outside the library, children passed by. Voices drifting, simple sounds. Miss Marple stepped into the lane. Her mind moved faster than her footsteps. She recalled Mrs. Helga Rowe's words. She had seen a tall man near the post office. Charcoal coat, asking for directions to Blythe's Lane, and Lydia Fernwell's uneasy glances. She had seen the same man near the church path, watching, not praying, not visiting, watching. Then Constable Brooker's quiet note. Someone matching that description had walked near the cottage 2 days earlier, asking about railway archives, asking about old matters. No reason given. Miss Marple turned onto Willowmere High Street. She reached the corner where the market bench sat, a place she herself had passed the day before. She paused. The shopkeeper outside the bakery, Mrs. Jonas Hibbett, leaned on her broom. Miss Marple, she said, that stranger you asked about. He stood right there yesterday. Didn't buy a thing. Didn't speak. Just stood. Miss Marple nodded slowly. And his coat? Charcoal checks, Mrs. Hibbett said. Very distinct. Miss Marple thanked her again. She continued her path. The truth arranged itself quietly in her mind. Silas Crane had visited Blythe 2 days before his death, not for pleasantries, not for conversation. His pattern was too deliberate, too controlled, too purposeful, Miss Marple whispered to herself. Soft, measured. He didn't come to visit. He came to silence. Miss Marple walked toward the vicarage that same afternoon. The path was quiet. Leaves gathered near the stone steps. Vicar Robert Ashcroft usually kept the place tidy, but today the grounds felt neglected. Something had disturbed the rhythm of this house as well. She knocked gently. The door opened with a soft creak. Mrs. Daisy Tremble, the housekeeper, stood there. She wrung her hands in her apron. Her eyes darted around as if checking the corners of the room. "Miss Marple." "You're early," she whispered. "I hope it's not inconvenient," Miss Marple said kindly. Mrs. Tremble stepped aside. "Not at all. The vicar is in his study." Miss Marple entered the hall. A faint smell of smoke lingered in the air. Not fireplace smoke. Different, sharper, paper smoke. Her eyes drifted toward the back door. The ash bin stood half open outside. A thin wisp of grey rose from the top. Very faint, very recent. "Mrs. Tremble," Miss Marple said softly, "has someone been burning rubbish today?" Mrs. Tremble froze. Her fingers tightened. She swallowed. "The vicar was cleaning old papers," she stammered. "Old sermons, old receipts." Miss Marple walked toward the back door without waiting for permission. Her calm steps carried more authority than force ever could. The vicarage yard was small, neat, but the ash bin told a different story. Miss Marple lifted the lid with her fingertips. Inside, half-burned papers. Edges curled, ink blurred, but not gone. She reached in with care. She lifted one charred fragment, then another. Her eyes read the faded lines. Not sermons, not receipts, railway notes, timetable pages, a corner of a letter. Harold Blythe's handwriting unmistakable. Miss Marple turned the fragment slowly. One of the scraps held the edge of a seal. Brown paper. Exactly the type Harold had used for the envelope he entrusted to her. She looked at Mrs. Tremble. The woman trembled even more now. Her lips parted as if trying to form words, but no sound came. Before Miss Marple could speak, Vicar Ashcroft hurried from the house. His eyes widened. "Miss Marple, what are you doing there?" She held up the half-burned scraps. "Cleaning old papers, Vicar." He stared at them, his face drained of color. I don't understand. Those aren't mine. I've never seen them." Mrs. Tremble stepped back toward the door. Her hands shook. "I didn't burn anything," she whispered. "Truly, I didn't. Someone used it in the night. I found the lid open this morning." Miss Marple studied her face. Truth, fear, but not guilt. Fear of something or someone. The vicar wiped his brow. "This is very troubling, Miss Marple. Whoever did this must have slipped in quietly. The gate wasn't locked. Anyone could have—" Miss Marple interrupted gently. "No, Vicar, not anyone." Both he and Mrs. Tremble looked at her with alarm. She lowered the charred papers, her voice quiet, precise. "Someone used your bin to burn evidence. Someone who knew this place. Someone close, but hiding in plain sight." Miss Marple walked toward the small studio behind Willowmere's fountain. Lydia Fernwell always painted there. The door stood half open. A faint smell of turpentine drifted out. Miss Marple tapped the frame lightly. Lydia turned quickly. Her hand jerked. A brush slipped from her fingers. It hit the floor with a soft tap. "Miss Marple, you startled me," she said. Miss Marple stepped inside. Her eyes moved gently across the room, noticing small things. Noticing Lydia's painting smock, a smear of soot across the sleeve. Dark. Fresh. "You've been near a fire," Miss Marple said quietly. Lydia hesitated. She wiped her hands on the smock. "Just the stove," she said. But her voice wavered. Too thin, too controlled. Miss Marple walked a little closer. "Your stove hasn't been lit today," she said, her tone soft, matter of fact. Lydia lowered her eyes. She breathed out slowly. "I may have walked by the vicarage. The wind carries soot. Sometimes it clings to things." Miss Marple said nothing. Silence was often more persuasive than questions. Lydia fidgeted with a cloth. Her fingers twisted the corner. Her shoulders tightened. "You were near Harold Blythe's lane yesterday," Miss Marple said calmly. Lydia froze. Her eyes widened a fraction. She said nothing. Miss Marple continued with gentle certainty. "Someone saw you, and I believe you saw someone else." Lydia swallowed. She turned away, facing her work table. Her voice softened. "Yes," she whispered. "I was there. But I didn't want to get involved. I didn't think it was my place." Miss Marple moved closer, still slow, still gentle. "What did you see, Lydia?" Lydia pressed her palms to the table. Her breath trembled. "I saw a man leaving Harold's lane. Tall, charcoal check coat. He walked fast, very fast. He kept his head down." "Silas Crane," Miss Marple said quietly. Lydia nodded. "I didn't know his name then. I only knew he didn't belong here. He looked determined." "Why hide what you saw?" Miss Marple asked. Lydia looked up. Her eyes were red. "I was frightened. Someone like him doesn't come to Willowmere for flowers and scenery, and he glanced at me once, just once. But it felt like he saw right through me." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "You believed he was dangerous?" Lydia nodded again. "Yes, and when I heard Harold had died, I thought people might blame me for staying silent." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on Lydia's arm. "You are not to blame for another's violence. But truth must be spoken when it matters." Lydia looked toward the window. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I didn't know Harold would be in danger. I only knew that man carried something dark with him." Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the easel in the corner. A canvas stood half-finished, brushstrokes still wet. A cottage, a window, a shadowed figure leaning toward it. Miss Marple stepped closer, her voice calm, certain. "You saw more than you realized, Lydia." She pointed to the canvas. A figure stood at Harold Blythe's window. Miss Marple visited the post office in the early afternoon. The bell above the door chimed softly as she entered. Mrs. Helga Rowe stood behind the counter, sorting envelopes with practiced care. She looked up at once. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said. "You're here earlier than usual." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I hope to speak with you, Mrs. Rowe. Just a small matter." Mrs. Rowe adjusted her glasses. Her hands paused over the stack of letters. "About Mr. Blythe, I suppose." Miss Marple nodded. "Something troubles me, and I believe you may have seen someone important." Mrs. Rowe hesitated for a moment. Then she lowered her voice. "You mean the tall man in the charcoal check coat?" Miss Marple said nothing. She simply waited. Mrs. Rowe took a breath. "He came in 2 mornings ago, just after opening. He stood right at that counter, said he needed to post a package urgently." "What kind of package?" Miss Marple asked. "A small one," Mrs. Rowe replied. "Flat, brown paper." He held it tightly, like he didn't want anyone to see the edges. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And did he give his name?" Mrs. Rowe nodded. "Yes. Silas Crane." He said it clearly. Too clearly, I thought. "Why too clearly?" Miss Marple asked. Mrs. Rowe tapped her fingers on the counter. "Because he kept glancing around, not like a man comfortable with his own words, more like a man rehearsing them." Miss Marple gave a small hum of thought. "And what else did he ask?" Mrs. Rowe's lips tightened. "Questions. Far too many. He asked where Harold Blythe lived. Asked if Harold still worked with railway papers. Asked if Harold got visitors. Asked if Harold ever posted anything unusual." Miss Marple's expression softened. "And what did you tell him?" "Only what everyone knows," Mrs. Rowe said quickly. "That Harold retired years ago, that he lived quietly, that he rarely came to the post office except to send small parcels." Miss Marple nodded. "You did nothing wrong." Mrs. Rowe looked relieved, but only briefly. Then her nerves returned. "There's something else," she whispered. "I kept his receipt." She reached under the counter and pulled out a small slip of paper. The ink was faint. but the signature stood out. Silas Crane. Miss Marple took the receipt. She studied the signature, long strokes, sharp corners, deliberate, practiced. She folded it once, then twice. "Mrs. Rowe," she said softly, "why did you keep this?" Mrs. Rowe leaned closer. "Because I didn't believe him. Something felt wrong, and when I heard about Harold, I couldn't forget that signature." Miss Marple opened her handbag and slipped the receipt inside. "You were right to keep it." Mrs. Rowe shivered. "Do you think he meant harm?" Miss Marple looked toward the window. Her voice dropped to a quiet certainty. "The man who signs his name too carefully often signs more than one." Mrs. Rowe's breath caught. "You mean?" Miss Marple nodded. "Forgery. He's done this before." Constable James Brooker hurried up Willowmere Lane with quick, heavy steps. He spotted Miss Marple near the green and waved her over. His face was flushed, his breath short. Something had been discovered. "Mrs. Marple," he said, "you should follow me. I think we've found something important." Miss Marple joined him without question. Calm steps, even pace. Years of quiet reasoning told her this would matter. They walked to the edge of the lane near the hedgerow. A small cluster of brambles had been pushed aside. Hidden beneath them lay a dark coat, thick fabric, charcoal checks, exactly as described. Constable Brooker lifted it with care. "It was half buried," he said. "Not by accident. Someone shoved it under the brush, someone in a hurry." Miss Marple nodded. "Silas Crane." Brooker reached into the coat pockets. One by one he pulled out the contents. First, soot, a faint line of it across the lining, dark streaks clinging to the fabric. Fresh, not from a house hearth, from travel, from old machinery, from a place touched by smoke and memory. Then a broken pen. The nib snapped clean. Ink stained the cap. Miss Marple studied it. "Someone used force," she said softly. "Or someone tried to write something he did not wish to finish." Brooker searched further. He pulled out a folded piece of paper. Old, brittle, edges yellowed. Miss Marple opened it slowly. A railway timetable, 20 years old, from the week of the East Bridge siding fire. The date circled, the same week Harold Blythe had written about. "That fire again," Brooker murmured. "Everything keeps coming back to it." Miss Marple nodded. The past always returns when the truth refuses to stay buried. One last item remained. A torn corner of an envelope. Brown paper, edges ripped with force. A piece of handwriting still visible. A slanted H, then a partial line. Miss Marple turned the scrap. Harold Blythe's writing. His style. His ink. Brooker let out a sharp exhale. "So Crane had the envelope. He must have taken it right after Harold gave it to you." Miss Marple looked at the scrap closely. Her expression remained calm but firm. "He retrieved the evidence Harold tried to protect," she said. "He destroyed much of it, but not all." Brooker looked puzzled. "What else is left?" Miss Marple folded the coat and set it aside. Her voice lowered. "Men who rush leave traces," she said. "And men who burn evidence leave pieces behind." Brooker waited for more, but Miss Marple did not answer yet. She looked toward Willowmere Hall in the distance, where the next piece of the pattern would appear, where threads would gather, where lies would tighten. She turned to Brooker. Quiet, steady. "He stole the evidence, but not all of it." Willowmere Hall stood at the top of the slope overlooking the village. Not grand, not imposing, just solid. Old rooms, quiet corridors, a place suited for truth to settle. Miss Marple requested everyone gather there. Constable Brooker arranged it. Dr. Philip Warren arrived first, then Lydia Fernwell, Mrs. Rowe, Vicar Ashcroft, and finally Silas Crane, brought under close watch, his expression sharp, defiant, eyes darting to each face. Miss Marple stood near the long table, her hands folded neatly, her voice calm. "Thank you all for coming. We have reached a point where clarity is needed. Silas scoffed softly. This is unnecessary. Miss Marple ignored him. She pointed to the first object on the table. The footprints. She described the heavy tread, the direction through the garden, the knowledge of the window's weakness. Silas shifted in his chair. Next, she lifted a small jar. Inside lay soot flakes, collected from Harold's window and from Crane's coat. The soot, she said. 2 sources, one from the cottage, one from the coat you abandoned. Mrs. Rowe watched him with wide eyes. Lydia looked down at the floor. Miss Marple placed his coat next on the table. The coat, she continued, hidden under brambles, buried in haste. Silas kept his jaw tight. He said nothing. Then she reached into her basket. Half-burned fragments, paper edges, a seal corner. The burned papers, she said. These were placed in the vicarage ash bin. Someone familiar with the grounds chose it. Someone who thought the vicarage was a safe spot. Vicar Ashcroft flushed with embarrassment. I had no idea, he murmured. Miss Marple nodded kindly. No one blames you, Vicar. The one who used your bin counted on that. She stepped closer to Silas Crane. Her voice gentled, but sharpened. You visited Harold 2 days ago. You demanded the old documents. You threatened him. You returned last night. You forced the window. You took the envelope. You burned what you could. Silas's face hardened. You have no proof. Miss Marple lifted the torn envelope corner. This is Harold's handwriting. This was in your coat. She placed it down. She held up the timetable next. From the week of the Eastbridge fire, the same week Inspector Holliver filed a destroyed report. A report you helped alter. Silas clenched his fists. Lydia flinched. Mrs. Rowe covered her mouth. Constable Brooker stepped forward. If you want to deny it, Crane, now's your chance. Silas stood suddenly. Anger lit his face. He moved toward the door. Mrs. Rowe burst into tears. Lydia froze. Dr. Warren glared with sudden recognition of the man who had loomed near Harold's lane. Silas reached the doorway, but Miss Marple's quiet voice stopped him. No, Mr. Crane. Running will not save you. Her tone remained soft, but sharp as logic. All eyes turned back to her. She looked at him with unwavering calm. And now, the truth. The drawing room of Willowmere Hall grew still. No one moved. No one spoke. Miss Marple stood near the small table, her hands gently folded. Her voice remained calm, her tone steady, but every word carried weight. Silas Crane, she began, you were not a harmless visitor. You were a man who returned to finish what should never have begun. Silas Crane shifted in his chair. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Miss Marple continued. You once served under Inspector Grant Holliver, not in a high post, not in a respected role, but you were present during the Eastbridge fire. You were there when the station master vanished. You were there when reports were changed. You held the pen, and you forged the lines. Lydia Fernwell gasped softly. Mrs. Helga Rowe hugged her arms. Vicar Ashcroft looked down at the floor. Miss Marple stepped closer. Her gaze never faltered. You believed your part was forgotten, but Harold Blythe kept notes. He saw what others ignored. He wrote down discrepancies. He tracked the missing report. And he knew Holliver could not have done all the altering alone. Someone else had to assist him, someone with access to the documents. Crane's eyes narrowed, still silent. But his breath changed. A small tell. Miss Marple went on. You visited Harold 2 days ago. You demanded the ledger, the old files, the envelope he held. When he refused, you grew angry. You forced your way into the cottage. You pushed past him. The shock alone was enough to make him collapse. A faint tremble moved across Mrs. Rowe's hands. Constable Brooker watched Crane carefully. Dr. Warren folded his arms, his face tight. Miss Marple kept her voice low. You did not intend to kill him, but you intended to take the proof. You took the envelope. You burned some pages in the vicarage bin. You tried to remove every trace of your past, every forged line, every altered date, every signature you wrote to protect Oliver. Crane finally spoke. Barely a whisper. You know nothing. Miss Marple responded with gentle certainty. I know enough, and I know fear when I see it. You feared Harold's memory. You feared his notes. And when you realized he had found something Oliver left behind, you panicked. Crane clenched his fists. You have no proof. Miss Marple lifted a small scrap from her pocket. You left this behind in your haste, a torn corner from Harold's envelope, his handwriting still visible. You could burn the rest. But this one piece survived. Silas Crane's face drained of color. Miss Marple turned to Constable Brooker. Mr. Crane visited Blythe not to reminisce, but to silence him. His motive was simple. He wanted to hide his own falsified reports. He has tried to erase the past for 20 long years. The room stayed silent. No voice rose. No protest came. Only the truth settled into place. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her final line soft, barely above a breath. But one piece of truth survived. Willowmere finally exhaled. The village settled. Sorrow eased its hold. Harold Blythe's name stood clear again. His sister Eleanor found quiet peace at last. Truth had walked a long road, but it had arrived. Miss Marple stood near the lane. She watched the soft movement of leaves. She spoke gently, almost to herself. Secrets ferment in silence, but truth waits for its hour. She turned toward the cottages, calm, certain. And somewhere in Willowmere, another whisper stirs. Davis returns with a warm smile. Thank you, dear friends, for joining us tonight, he says softly. Tell me, what clue surprised you most? And where are you listening from tonight? He invites listeners to share their thoughts in the comments and stay connected with the Curious Case family. A gentle pause follows as the music settles. Tomorrow, Davis says, almost a whisper. Another kettle will boil. Stay cozy with us a little longer and stay curious, always. Before you go, remember to subscribe for more gentle mysteries. Watch another story to keep the warmth going. And return tomorrow for the next whisper from Willowmere. Your seat by the fire is always waiting.